Welcome to episode 321 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I am your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about the Xbox Developer Direct, Dragon Age The Veilguard sales numbers, Assassin's Creed Shadows previews, and much more. Before we get started, thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting this show and all of my other content, check out the link in the show description. Subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite app. Leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Let's jump into that gaming news and start it off with the main story for the week. The Xbox Developer Direct for 2025. So leading into this, the big thing here was we knew we'd be getting information about South Midnight from Compulsion, Clair Obscur Expedition 33 from a third-party studio, and Doom: The Dark Ages, obviously from Bethesda, and that's what we got. But there was also a surprise thing that we knew was coming, but we didn't know what it was going to be. And then it showed up, and it was Ninja Gaiden 4, a new game. It's going to be published by Xbox. It's considered technically a first-party Xbox game. Xbox doesn't own the rights to the series, but this is a similar situation, I guess, to like Helldivers 2, except PlayStation does own the Helldivers IP, but it's a third-party studio that's making a game, and Xbox is the one putting it out to the world. So when it's on PlayStation, when it's on PC, when it's everywhere, it will open up with a Xbox, Studios logo or whatever. At least I would assume it would. The unique thing about this project is that it's a combination of both Team Ninja and Platinum Games. So it seems like what I've seen, the most people are excited about that partnership is exciting, is really cool for people who are into the games that they make. And like for me, my only real experience with games from these are from Platinum mostly, and it's Nier Automata, which I really enjoyed a lot. It's just like a mind F of a game. And so this seems really cool. I'm going to be totally honest. I've dabbled in the old games. I believe it was more like I rented some of them when I was a GameStop employee. But they're just hard. And so I'm not, I play a lot of games. I'm pretty good at certain games, especially, competitive like FPS games. But these type of games were never my thing. And this was only reinforced by the little special announcement at the end of this segment, where they announced that Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, which is a remake of Ninja Gaiden 2 from the 360, I believe. It's a remake in Unreal Engine 5. They shadow dropped it, so it's available everywhere. It's a multi platform game, but it is on Game Pass day one, and that goes for everything in this direct, in this developer direct, that including Ninja Gaiden 4 will be on Game Pass this fall when it comes out. So I actually did load up Ninja Gaiden 2 Black. I've played a little bit of it. I'm just so bad at those games. I don't like anything that involves parrying and is very dependent on parrying. I'm just going to struggle, and I definitely did. But it was cool to at least check it out. I gave it a little bit more of a chance than I've probably given other games. And it's cool, and I started to get the hang of it. But I've got other stuff I want to play right now, so we'll see how much I ever get back into that. But regardless, I'm sure I'll check out Ninja Gaiden 4. It was cool to check out Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, and I've seen people wanting a new Ninja Gaiden game for a long time. So I don't know if this has the biggest audience on earth. I think these two devs working together definitely helps. But yeah, we'll see what happens with that. Then we had South of Midnight by Compulsion. This is a first-party Xbox game. This will only be on Xbox and PC, or at least at launch. They haven't said anything about PlayStation yet. They did a deep dive into the story, especially the gameplay, music, and some of the characters. This game has given me like really strong, like really cool double A vibes. That even in the so like in the gameplay portion, there was a part where a big part of South of Midnight is that you are cleansing the land. They introduce at the beginning, or they talk about the story, and you and your mom are in a in the house when this hurricane or this big storm comes, washes away your house with your mom still in it. You get out, and then long story short, she gets these like magical powers that are based in like Southern lore and Southern history and storytelling. And it's really cool. I really do like it. Same with all the villains and enemies and all this stuff, and allies. It seems other NPCs. But there's a part where the whole idea is that you're weaving, you're using this weaving tool to get like the corruption off of these creatures and these enemies you're dealing with. And there was one little clip, and I don't want to make too much of it because I'm excited about this game. The music sounds great, the characters seem cool, the voice acting is really good, and the gameplay looks fun. But it just stuck out like a sore thumb to me, where there's this creature or this object that she was taking the weave off of, and then instead of having an animation of it going from its like messed up state to its cleansed state, it just disappeared and then came back. Now, this game's not out yet. It comes out in April. I believe this one was April 24th, I believe, if I remember correctly. Or the 8th. I think it's the 8th because I think there's early access for it, which everyone's going to get mad about. April 8th. So it's not too far away, but they could still be polishing stuff up. Maybe this thing isn't final, or maybe I won't even notice when I actually play the game. I think that's extremely likely. This just looks really cool. I'm really happy about this. This is the kind of game that, if I have to be honest, this would be the type of game I would have expected to be more of a multi-platform game. But that's, instead of Doom Dark Ages, which we'll talk about soon. But that's where this is going. And that's me stuck in the old way of thinking. And a lot of people still are stuck in the old way of thinking, even, in the days since this thing. I've seen fairly big influencers and stuff being like, oh, if you don't like that dev direct, blah, blah, blah. How could you not like this dev direct? It was really, really good from start to finish, even if they're games you're not personally super interested in. I'm not really interested in Ninja Gaiden 4, but I thought it was a cool presentation. Seems like a neat game. I'm sure I'll try it out, but I'm not like licking my chops for it, But South of Midnight looks fun. I'm excited to play it. It looks like it's gonna, hit you in the feels at the end, and I enjoy that out of a game. So, and maybe you can romance the alligator. I don't know. Then moving on to Clair Obscur Expedition 33. This is a third-party game being made by a studio in France. It started off as one guy. They kind of told the story of the development. It started off as one guy who built a team and has turned it into this like really cool story. The whole idea is that these people live in this like 19th century French kind of aesthetic, this world. It's like an alternate reality, obviously. And there is this creature or I don't know if we really know what it is yet, off in the distance of the people where they live. And every year it writes a new number, and everyone that age or older dies, and that number goes down every year. The implication is that eventually that number is going to get so low that everyone's going to be dead, or at least all of the adults will be dead, and then the children will fend for themselves. And one thing that I wonder if they'll address it in this game is obviously the overarching concern is that they'll get down to zero and everyone will die. I wonder if they'll address the fact that really you would just have to get down below like 10 or 11 and there's no more reproduction happening, even though it's kind of weird to consider it even slightly above that, but still moving on. When you get down to like 6 or 7, well, at some point there's, I guess, then there's no kids being born. So then you get down to like, how low do you get before there's just no one left? And then like those last few years, everyone just dies, like just starves to death. it gets dark, right? So obviously the idea of this game is that there's expeditions every year, and they send out the people who are the age who are about to die, so the year before, the 34-year-olds, the 35, 36, blah blah blah. And we are going to be going out into this world to try to stop this process. It's what I liked about it is they talked about in the direct of like, we don't want it to just be this black and white bad guy. It's a force of nature. This creature that's doing this. We don't know their motivations. We don't know why they're doing it. Like all of that is kind of obscure. Pun definitely intended. And then we'll just go from there. So the mystery is cool. They showed a bunch of gameplay. Again, this is the game that's like the action turn-based game. So when you're attacking, say, you can hit prompts to have more effective attacks. And then when you're being attacked, they said it specifically, if you time things right, you can prevent any damage from happening to your team every single round if you can get the parry right and all that, which I assume will be challenging and won't happen all the time. But that definitely, that like being involved at all times thing makes me way more excited than, I love Baldur's Gate 3. It's probably at this point my favorite game of all time. I don't know if it's knocked off Red Dead 2 yet, but it's definitely up there. And I've learned to enjoy the turn-based combat in that game, which is very classic D&D, even though I assume it's dumbed down quite a bit. But it's, a very classic turn-based fighting game or combat game. And I've learned to enjoy it. It's still not my favorite, and definitely not. I've tried other turn-based games since then, thinking like, oh, this was my awakening. Now I like these games, and I don't. I've tried. I tried Metaphor Refantasio and with the Like a Dragon games. Like there's other games which kind of have this Expedition 33 system, the Like a Dragon games, I believe. I just can't get into them, and there's other reasons for that too. But Pizza Morg won't let me forget. Will never forgive me if I keep on that. So we'll move on. Regardless, this game looks super cool. I love the aesthetic of it. In the conversation, we'll be talking about Dragon Age The Veilguard later, but a big conversation around that game was the stylized look of the game and how the characters had like a sort of realistic look, but they also looked a little cartoony. They had exaggerated features and their heads were real big and stuff like that. I think Dragon Age The Veilguard looks fine. I don't think it's the most visually impressive game I've ever seen, but I also don't think it looked bad. Expedition 33, I think, is doing what Dragon Age was going towards and just does it way better. Definitely a more realistic aesthetic, but still like stylized for sure. Everyone's hair, like everyone's hot in this game. There's just no denying that. They know what they're going for with that, and that's fine. The voice acting cast in this is crazy. I believe the main male character is Charlie Day. And then there's like half of the Baldur's Gate 3 cast is in this, including Shadowheart's a voice actress, which is just the best. I'm so excited about that. The only thing I'm worried about is that, they really reinforced in this thing that this is a small team. This is their first game. There's that concern, and I've seen both sides of this argument, but like that maybe it could be too big or it could be too small. Like they're portraying this game, and even in this preview, as being this giant world with, so you're talking about a game that maybe it's going to be 30, 40, 50 hours, but then it's coming from a small studio, and it's their first game, and it, maybe it's only gonna be like 10 or 15 hours. Who knows? Maybe there's various ways you can play through and it's replayable. I don't know. So we'll have to wait and see that. One thing that I really enjoyed about this developer direct was that they showed that the game has like a goofy, kind of a silly, like a lighthearted side to it. They showed us some of the like human characters we'll interact with. There's one who's this kind of monkey looking guy, who can, when you defeat enemies, he can take a piece of that enemy and keep it and turn into that creature during combat and things like that. And then there's this other creature that they showed off that's kind of our de facto transportation. These big, powerful balloon-looking creatures that lets us go around different parts of the game, the region, in an overworld map, which is something they talked a lot about, how it's not a thing you see much anymore in video games, especially RPGs. I want to say Final Fantasy X is what people were referencing with this. So the idea is that you're running through this map of the world to go to different places to do missions and so on. But it's not like a big open world game. It's a map that you run on. I assume they'll have some mechanics and things like that, but you can do everything from running on it yourself. You see your individual characters running through the world, or like this big creature can run through it and you can ride on them. They're like a vehicle, or they can even fly around as well. I assume those are, abilities you unlock as the game goes, because they reference that you give them these gems, this big balloon creature, you give them these gems and it unlocks abilities. So I assume we'll have something like that. Um, yeah, I just, this game, from the music to the graphics to the gameplay to the story that they've talked about to the character interactions, and all the different motivations that they have, to the stakes of the story, if they land this game, I could easily see this game being like a game of the year contender. It's got all the right parts. Now it's got to land it. It's got to come out. It's got to be, have a strong beginning, middle, and end. It's got to have minimal bugs and things like that for people to really be into it. It's a game that, maybe if they don't quite launch it the way they wanted, it could end up with like a score in the 70s or something. But I think if they nail it, you're talking about a game that I think could easily reach the 90s, if enough people get into it. I still do think there's a small issue of, maybe this type of game won't be for everyone. Baldur's Gate 3 suffered from that a little bit. Despite its legendary status, you still have a lot of fairly prominent game journalists and stuff like that who never really played it or gave it a chance because they're so stuck in the idea that they don't like that kind of game or that combat and stuff, which is where I kind of was until I played it for a couple hours, and I've been hooked ever since. I'm playing it again right now. So Clair Obscur Expedition 33 coming out. I believe that's the one that comes out on April 24th. Just a completely stacked beginning of the year here, which only gets worse with Doom the Dark Ages. I actually won't talk a ton about this because this was one that I think you should just go watch, especially. Basically, you just rip and tear. It's another rip and tear game. A big thing they emphasized, though, was that in the previous games, it was a lot about like acrobatics and, jumping around and doing that. Where with the Dark Ages, there's a big emphasis on, the Doomslayer is a tank, and you aren't, dodging around and getting away from things. You're running into things or just hacking it out with these big scary enemies. And the mechanics in the game that they showed definitely reflects that. One thing I do think is kind of interesting is that they are introducing, and I'm sure it'll be fairly limited, but there's going to be moments in the game where you get into this big Doomslayer mech and you fight these other gigantic demon creatures, and even to the point where you can traverse around the game world on a dragon. Like you can definitely tell they feel the need to have to, like step it up with all these games and make the scope bigger and wilder and all that. Like some of the footage they showed was of you fighting literally hundreds of enemies. So the weapons they showed, the shield that has a saw on the outside of it that you can throw around like Captain America or whatever. Like it looked really, really cool. And more than anything, I just highly suggest just watch this one. I can only describe it so much. It was a very visual presentation. So I do suggest checking that one out. And that game comes out in May. Can't remember the exact date, but it's coming out fairly soon. And that was a big one that I thought was kind of interesting. And it gets into another conversation of Doom the Dark Ages is coming out day one on PlayStation. And that is a straight up first party developed, first party published game from Xbox. And it's going to be one of the first, and I'm sure it won't be the last, of the games there's not going to be even an exclusivity window of 6 months or whatever, the way that we're probably going to see with Indiana Jones. And, the expectation is we'll eventually see Starfield and some of these other games that have come out in the last couple of years go over the PlayStation and other platforms as well. Doom the Dark Ages is day one. And I remember back when they initially announced that, and there was some pushback on it. And Phil Spencer talked a lot about how, we talked to the studio And they, the first two games of this kind of rebooted Doom series were on all the platforms, and they wanted to keep it that way. And so that's what we're going to do. Like it, I think it's so interesting that you see so much more drama and so much more hurt feelings and stuff, in the periphery of the gaming community of, these people who I think some people may truly just be a little too connected to the boxes and feel a little too personal about this kind of stuff. Obviously, there's a large number of people too who are just, baiting people, grifting, doing the doomer stuff just to get attention. But I really do believe that most people, like, you walk down the street and you see a guy say, "Hey, do you play games?" He's like, "Yeah, I play games every now and then." "Oh, do you care that Xbox is going to put their games on other platform on PlayStation or Switch?" They'd be like, "No, that's cool." And then they just move down the street, like that they wouldn't have some, drop to the ground, flailing arms and legs, tantrum about Xbox doing this, because most people don't care. A lot of people don't even know. Like, I remember when I worked at GameStop, how many people would come in, people buying gifts and stuff like that. And they'd be like, "Oh, hey, can I get that Halo game?" And I'd be like, "Oh yeah, do they have an Xbox?" Because you learn to ask, even for exclusive games, you learn to ask. They'd be like, "Oh no, I think he has a PS3," and I'd be like, "Well, actually, you can't. That doesn't work. That's probably not how things are going to be in the future. It's just going to be, can I have that game? Sure. Now, is GameStop going to be around to do that? Absolutely not, unless the meme stocks keeping going on. But it just, I think, with this stuff, only really kind of the weirdos and the people who benefit from being weird about it care. Games journalists, influencers, console warriors, kind of some of the worst. I'm sure there's a few random people who are truly hurt by it, but those people are kind of on the fringe anyways, in my opinion. And all of the arguments I've seen for, like, "Oh, it dilutes Xbox's brand, blah 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 blah," I just don't believe that. If anything, I think these moves that they're making further ensures that they'll do things like make first party hardware and things like that, because if that's not the make or break of their business, the way it seems to be with, like, with PlayStation or Nintendo, selling as many console units as possible, when the focus then turns to releasing games often that are good and making money to sustain the company and to help improve the company, I think those are the things they're going for now. And they aren't, like PlayStation, where they're still obsessed with selling more consoles than everyone else. And what's funny about that is that we're going to get to a point very much sooner than later where, they're going to be competing with no one there. Even this gen, you could argue that, there's no real victory of PlayStation unit sales over Xbox. Xbox, that was never an emphasis of this gen for them. And next gen is probably only going to be even less. So I think it's an interesting thing to pay attention to. The industry is definitely changing. And I think that some of the platforms are preparing for that, or even diving into that a little more so than others. But that doesn't mean it's going to work. So we'll have to wait and find out. But overall, I thought this was a really, really good show. I thought all four games looked really great, even if I'm not like super interested in Ninja Gaiden or Doom. I'll still definitely try both of them out. I'll play all four of these games. Two of them I'm super excited to. Two of them I'm curious. And that's the best part of Game Pass, for its ups and downs. I've probably tried out twice as many games. Like I've played twice as many games in the last 5 or 6 years than I would have otherwise. And while a lot of those didn't land for me, some of them definitely did, and it was a big surprise, and it really worked out. It got me into some fandoms I didn't expect to be in, which is really, really cool. What I'm really curious about is that, this game announced 3 games with South of Midnight, Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, and Doom: The Dark Ages to release in the first half of this year, before June. Ninja Gaiden 4 is this fall or later in the year. That makes me assume that the June showcase is going to be another opportunity for them to, I assume, talk about games coming in 26, 27, whatever. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if the June showcase is them saying, like, "Hey, we've got Fable coming in August, and we've got this game, I don't know, State of Decay 3 or something coming in November, and maybe something else in December." It seems like after all these years, ever since they began with their, buying up studios like Undead Labs, Compulsion, and then moving on to Bethesda ZeniMax, and then most recently with ABK, it seems like with all these studios and all this investment, it's starting to actually work. Their dream of having a AAA big release every quarter is coming true. And I think that's cool. I think it's great for gamers, especially because they're being a little more relaxed about platforms. And it's especially great for people on Game Pass because it just means that you're getting even more value out of that service. So there's my spiel on it. I thought it was a good show. I'm excited to see what they do in the showcase in June. I'm excited to see if PlayStation does their own show here relatively soon in the next month or so. And then in April, I guess we'll hear from Nintendo to see more about the Switch 2. So it's going to be an interesting year. Moving to some other stories, we have Dragon Age The Veilguard sales numbers were released. Kind of. It was kind of vague, but we know roughly how many people have played it, and that we can go from there. So EA released a statement that said EA commented on lowering their quarterly revenue expectations from 2.4 to 2.5 billion. They're lowering it down to 2.2 billion for the third quarter, I believe, of the 2025 fiscal year. I think they count it as the year it ends, which their fiscal year ends, I guess it's April. I think April is the end of April is their fiscal year. It is funny that their projections it's something along the lines of like, this fiscal year they're projecting like $9 billion of revenue or something, or 8 billion, and now they're projecting like a $500 million less, which is like a ton of money. I'm not gonna pretend like that's not a big deal, but it just seems like to these giant corporations, the idea of like having a meltdown over what to their scale doesn't really seem like that much money is just kind of interesting. The blame for this was split between EA FC 25, the game that was previously known as FIFA, as well as Dragon Age The Veilguard. The claim with Dragon Age is that it reached around 1.5 million players, but they were anticipating closer to 3 million in this first 3 months that it was released. I think that's an interesting part of this. I think that 3 million number is probably realistic for a lot of games. There's we've seen lots of games come out recently that hit big sales numbers fairly quickly. We've also seen a bunch that haven't. A notable one that I keep making an example of is we're like 15 or 16 months out since the Alan Wake 2 release, a cult classic game, a sequel that people were really excited about, a wonderful game, a very beautiful game, a very well-made game, a fun game, a really great story, all of that. And to this day, that game still hasn't sold 2 million copies. We're more than a year out. And there were lots of articles, especially early, about how they hadn't even recouped their development cost yet. And so you have a game like that was getting like Game of the Year consideration, that won various awards for various reasons, very deservedly. It was one of my favorite games of 2023. Not to mention, it was one of the best games in 2023, a year that had was one of the wildest years ever in video games, that had so many good games. And Alan Wake 2 still stood out, and it still didn't sell that well. And we're seeing it with lots of other games too right now, where you'll have these big AAA games come out and they'll be received like they'll do okay. At the very they'll get Metacritic and OpenCritic scores in the 80s and 90s, and then we'll see a few months later, they've sold like 1 million copies. It's weird, especially because my content creation started with games like the Division 1 and 2. Games that at that time, the Division 1 sold like 10 million copies like pretty quick, and so did the Division 2. But what happened with the Division 2 is similar to what I think is happening here with Veilguard, is that even though the Division 2 sold really, really well, Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which came out in a similar time frame, didn't. It sold really bad. And when the press release came out, because they have to do them because they're publicly traded, the words were, Ghost Recon Breakpoint and the Division 2 underwhelm in sales or come in under projections or whatever the actual wording was. And then that led to, people still bringing up about Division 2. Oh, it disappointed in sales. Division 2's probably sold 15 to 20 million copies at this point. Like, it's didn't disappoint in sales. It did extremely well, but they had to explain this quarterly drop in revenue expectations. Now keep that in mind, that this isn't even, revenue loss necessarily. It's just their projections have lowered, which is a whole different problem with all this stuff. But I don't think it's as big of a deal as people have made it. I've said for a really long time that I think that their goal with Veilguard financially was to get it out and recoup some money. This game went through multiple iterations, probably was pretty expensive to make, I have to imagine, and has a lot of, a studio's future riding on its shoulders, at least in some capacity. And I just don't, I don't think 1.5 million potential sales in the first 3 months is bad. It's just not great. And a really interesting part about this, which I want to get into now, is that the Jason Schreier article mentioned, and this was in the release as well, that most of the blame was being pinned on by EA, was being pinned on FC25, but it didn't have any numbers mentioned, which this to me, in the way that they released this information, EA, was, I think, them kind of throwing Veilguard under the bus a little bit, to kind of save face with FC25. This is I believe the first game they've released that didn't have the FIFA branding on it, because they lost that deal, or they didn't really lose it. They just didn't want to pay. It was like $2 billion for the rights or something to FIFA. It's a disgusting organization. And I found it curious that EAFC 25 is almost certainly, like, its lackluster sales are probably the reason for most of these projections getting lowered and the lower revenue numbers. But they didn't mention its actual numbers sales wise and stuff like that. But they did with Veilguard, and they made sure to say, like, oh, and it, the 1.5 million was only 50% of what we were expecting. Like, this stuff happens all the time. And it's happened to me before in my fandom, where it's really obvious that they're just, they're kind of playing games to not, to basically save face. And that seems like what happened here. Like, it's important to remember, in 2021, I looked it up, FIFA, the FIFA's revenue for that year accounted for more than half of EA's gaming revenue. While that number may have dropped in the last couple of years, it's probably still expected to be about half, is what I would guess. So, Dragon Age of the Veilguard, comes in under and makes, say it came in 50 to 100 million under what they were hoping to make out of it revenue wise. If you have, the similar amount, I suspect EAFC 25 came in a lot less than that. Like, I suspect that, if they're doing all these moves and they're making this big deal of it, I suspect that EAFC lost maybe potentially billions. I would be surprised if it was that dramatic, but we're probably not talking about 50 to 100 million dollars that they didn't get that they expected. We're probably talking about multi-million, hundreds of millions of dollars. And I just still think it was very interesting to get that. It is worth noting that on February 4th, that's the quarterly investor call for EA. That's publicly done. You can listen to it to yourself if you want. They're typically pretty dry. I believe it's Andrew Wilson, I believe, is still the CEO of EA. He's the one who typically does them. They're just a bunch of financial speak, but you tend to be able to get some interesting info out of them. And I think a lot of people now are kind of curious to how that's going to be presented, and if any of these like EAFC numbers get clarified or anything like that. I am definitely curious. I've been pretty annoyed about how this has been covered. News articles, social media, and the grifters have obviously taken advantage of the situation and pushed their whole, go woke, go broke narrative, which is kind of funny because I think that, if you actually pay attention to the way that game was received, I think the people like me who are newer to the series or new entirely really liked it because it's a fun game. It's a fun game with, cool characters and hot people, and the combat's a lot of fun and the story is pretty good and all that. That where it seems like they really missed was with the existing Dragon Age fan base, even people within my community. It was pretty obvious that the lack of impact of the previous games, or some of the decisions they made in this game in Veilguard, really rubbed the like existing Dragon Age community the wrong way, and definitely probably didn't lead to that word of mouth that typically is so good for video games, where the hardcore fans of that series are telling everyone and their brother to buy this game and play it. I don't think that was as much of a factor with this game, because it seems like, and at least the vocal part of the community is pretty annoyed with a lot of the decisions they made. And there's typically acknowledgement of like, yeah, it's a fun game, it's a good game, it's very well made, polished, it's it does a lot of things right. But the common thread tends to be it's not a great Dragon Age game, and I can appreciate that. So the way it's been covered has been really frustrating. One of the worst examples was posted, I believe, on the 28th, or on the 23rd, by Insider Gaming, the publication run by Tom Henderson. That the headline and the tweets they put out and everything was, EA stocks fall. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. EA stocks fall 17% due to underwhelming sales of Dragon Age: The Veilguard, and like, that's not true. At the very least, you mention EAFC 25 and Dragon Age: The Veilguard, or you pin it on EAFC 25, which is who EA's pinning it on. The majority of this, this revenue, drop that then led to a stock market drop. But they didn't do that. They very clearly blamed it on Dragon Age: The Veilguard, and in my opinion, that's not like a whoopsie. That's a very, 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 very purposeful action, especially Tom Henderson and the type of people I think he appeals to commonly. It's targeting that anti-woke, anti-DEI, super duper sensitive little boys, doing who follow all the grifters and get into all the culture war stuff. It's you're targeting those people. You're trying to improve clicks on that article, on those tweets, on those social media posts from those people, because they're rabid. Like, they eat this stuff up, especially whether it's true or not, where here it obviously wasn't. And one of my favorite things was in the comments of Tom Henderson's post about this, when he posted the article that had I would call it a lie in the headline. People were like, oh, didn't they say it was actually FC25? And he's like, well, that's in the article. It's like, come on, man. Like, no one reads those articles, and even if they do, they go into that one with what the headline says, and then are probably too dumb to realize that the actual article says something else. So that was really frustrating. I'm glad I saw a bunch of people teeing off on them for that. The frustrating reaction to that, when pointing out that like hypocrisy or that dishonesty, was people being like, well, it missed 50% of their expected sales. That's still bad. And it's like, I'm not talking about that. Like, I'm talking about this, to some people, respected gaming news outlet, just being straight up dishonest in a headline and a story that's very obviously just trying to bait clicks. And it's okay to do a little exaggeration, massage the truth a little bit, to get something that's a little more clicky. But I don't think you can just straight up lie. But I guess you can, because I didn't see anyone high profile calling them out for it. The interesting thing about with all this is the FC 25. It'll be fine. My guess is that I don't know much about the FIFA community or the FC community. If I had to guess, its lackluster sales were probably partially due to the lack of brand recognition, and changing from FIFA to EAFC it's a big change. Like, that's just from a straight average big old dummy looking at the wall of games. That's going to have some impact. My guess is that the actual game just didn't really do anything that interesting, didn't add anything that was that big of a deal or whatever. And they'll figure it out. They kind of have to, because the sports division, but especially FC, the soccer game or the football game, for my non-American friends, it is a really big deal for them. They need it to do well. So now I'm just curious to what game they'll blame it on next, other than themselves. And then for BioWare, for Dragon Age: The Veilguard, I think it does put them in a weird spot. My hope was, like I said before, that the goal with getting it out was recognizing, like, this game, it's taken a long time to make. It's had lots of trials and tribulations. Let's just get it out. Let's just make a good game. Let's get it out, and then we're gonna move on. And even I don't even have this in my notes, but even yesterday, or they released their last patch notes for Dragon Age: The Veilguard. It even says in the patch notes, it gives the impression that unless some big catastrophic issue pops up that they haven't already addressed, there's no more patches coming for Veilguard. It's likely that there's been a pretty minuscule team working on that game anyways recently. And we've seen lots of articles, and it can be assumed as well that the next Mass Effect game is the next big project. We know that there's a handful of people who have either left BioWare or are working at other studios on other games. But I don't know that there's 250 to 300 people working on other games, and we'll talk more about that in another segment here. But we know that, like, Corian Bush left, who is the creative director on Dragon Age: The Veilguard. John Epler, we recently noticed on his profile that he's the narrative director at the studio that's making Skate. He's still with EA technically, and some of his social media still says he's at BioWare. And so it sounds like this may be one of those lone situations, or maybe not. And then there's been a handful of other devs I've noticed who are more like frontline devs, more, not out, more entry level, or, whatever you would want to call that, who are working on the Iron Man game at EA Motive, or working over on on Battlefield 6, whatever that's going to be called. I think that's interesting. The kind of final thing that I think means that there's probably some stuff going on with Mass Effect is that Mike Gamble's been tweeting a lot. He typically only does that, from what I've noticed, when there's about to be something to say. Hopefully it's a good thing. I've been keeping a close eye on that BioWare careers page and their blog and all that, anticipating some kind of statement from them. Gary McKay, who's the head of BioWare, typically does like a beginning of the year blog to kind of talk about what they've done and what they've got going on. I don't think he did that this year, and he didn't do it last year either, because they were posting so much about Dragon Age. So I'm anticipating some kind of update about that. I would assume at some point this year, Dragon Age: The Veil, or the next Mass Effect, goes into production. And they, at least with Veilguard, did like fairly big announcements about that and things. So we'll have to wait and see. I think BioWare is going to be okay. I don't think this is as bad as some people are trying to paint it to be. 1.5 million sales is no slouch. It's just not probably going to sell 10, 20 million copies either. So we'll see what happens with that. Ted Price, the founder of Insomniac, is retiring. He's going to be replaced by 3 of their current, kind of leadership people, as kind of like a co-head situation of the studio. I think he's been out with 25, 30 years or something. I'm curious to be a fly on the wall at PlayStation right now, because any change, especially a change that big, is a big deal. Insomniac, we know it's got the next Wolverine game coming. I'm sure they're working on another Spider-Man game. That studio has released so many games so quickly, Ratchet and Clank and so on, that it's kind of hard to forget that, like, they release like 2, 3, 4 games a generation, where Naughty Dog and Santa Monica and the other PlayStation studios are, at this point, seems like they're lucky to release a game a generation. And we don't even really know, like, we don't know what Santa Monica's doing next. We know Naughty Dog now is working on the space game, the space sci-fi game, but we don't know when it's coming or all of that. So I'd be really curious to see what the vibe is around PlayStation right now and the executives, because now they're seeing their studio that's been their most productive studio pretty easily is going to go under new leadership, and not just under new leadership, and 3 new people who aren't the founder. which I do think that carries some kind of unique feel when it comes to leadership. Good for him. Obviously, dude's a legend in the industry, deserves a break. I'm sure he's had many sleepless nights and angry family weekends from probably being maybe at least at one point in his career maybe too focused on the studio. But that's why they're as successful as they are and why they're one of the premier studios in gaming. So I am curious to what this means for their future, and we'll have to wait and see. Um, I think that the big issue with them having new leadership is, was he able to push back on, PlayStation wanting them to make a live service game or whatever? Because now, there's just been so many resources and so much time and so much money wasted by PlayStation and these, half dozen, live service games that have either been canceled or came out and then got canceled shortly after, or are still in development, supposedly. Uh, that they were able to do that stuff without the company being in too much trouble because they had an Insomniac, putting out games and making money. Even if their games didn't sell insane amounts, they still sold well, and I'm sure they made money on all of them. So it's an interesting time over there, I think. It's also an interesting time over at BioWare. We're going back to them for this story. Mark Darrah, who was a former creative director and longtime veteran employee at BioWare before he left a few years ago, he put out a video called Dragon Age The Veilguard has shipped. Now what? So to keep in mind about Mark Darrah, he worked at BioWare for a really long time. He left the same time that Casey Hudson did. And he came back and started working for them. I want to say it was about a year and a half ago as a contractor to help them ship Dragon Age The Veilguard. And shortly after launch, I think he announced that he was no longer on contract with BioWare. And then he makes this video. So what was really interesting about this video, again, it's called Dragon Age The Veilguard has shipped. Now what? I highly suggest you check it out. Go watch it. Because it's a good just summary of the industry. If you care about BioWare or Mass Effect or Dragon Age, it's obviously an interesting video to watch because you learn a lot about how those games are developed and what their future may look like. But even if you are just a gamer, if you're just curious about the games industry, it's a super interesting video because he, whether he meant to or not, does a really good job of showing how the industry has changed so much in 25 plus years. And that, when BioWare first started, shortly after they became a studio, they were juggling like 5, 6, 7 different projects. And some of them worked out, some of them didn't. But then as the years went on, that scale got smaller and smaller, or that number got smaller and smaller as the scale of the games got bigger and bigger. And, at the end of the video, he's talking about how, with Mass Effect, and even Dragon Age The Veilguard to a point, the next Mass Effect game will likely be the first game developed by BioWare from beginning to end as the only big project they're working on. They'll probably spin off some teams and start pre-production on some, the next Dragon Age game or maybe something else, who knows. But for those reasons, it's a really good video. He kind of goes through BioWare having these like 5 stages in these big events, and I won't go into them, but I do suggest you check out that video, definitely. At the end of the video, he talks a lot, or a little bit at least, about the next Mass Effect, and the kind of ups and downs of it being like the main project. Obviously the ups of it are that, there are 250, 300 devs are all going to be working on one game. So when it comes to getting things done, when it comes to, how quickly that game can be developed and released, that obviously improves it. They don't have the team split in half. They have all the resources being pumped into one game. In theory, there's definitely a too many cooks in the kitchen issue that can come up. But in theory, the more devs, the faster the game comes out, and hopefully the higher quality and all that. One kind of big downside he's talked about is how, like I mentioned, that John Epler is, at the studio making Skate, as well as a few other people, have either left the company, but namely the ones who are at, EA Motive working on Iron Man, who are at DICE working on Battlefield. If those are like low level devs where they're doing fairly basic tasks, they can be brought back over to BioWare as soon as Mass Effect is done with pre-production and they need them to start production, which is, I assume, going to happen this year. those fairly, low folks can be brought back over. But like John Epler is the narrative director at that studio now on Skate. I think Skate's coming out this year or next year at the latest. But the narrative director isn't just going to get pulled over to Mass Effect. It's way more likely that he's going to be there working on that, on Skate's narrative director position until that game comes out. And then he may come back over to Mass Effect, or maybe he won't. And that was something that Mark Darrah talked a lot about, is that you have an issue where, some of these people may get on these other projects like Battlefield or Iron Man, and, and they know the intent is for them to come back and work on Mass Effect, and maybe they're excited about that. But then they start working on this other project, they get invested, maybe they get, some tasks that they really want to do. Maybe they get, a role that they really like. Maybe they don't come back, and that, that creates its own challenges. The other thing I think that came up more in my own community is the idea that, like, if you're going to have the whole studio, where there used to be like the Dragon Age team and the Mass Effect team. Well, if that's all one team now, the same thing, it may have happened both ways, but like you may have had people who got hired at BioWare to work on Mass Effect, and over the last year and a half, they helped out with Dragon Age. That may not have been what they really wanted to do. There may have been a lack of motivation to really get super excited about that. Where then it's probably going to happen the other way as well. There's probably going to be Dragon Age devs who have maybe only worked on Dragon Age, or mostly only worked on that, who maybe don't really love the idea of working on a sci-fi space game. So I'm curious how it works out. I'm going to remain, optimistic as always. That's kind of my thing. But it's definitely going to be interesting. And no matter what happens, I think one day we're going to be in for some really interesting stories about how about how all this worked out. So, but I think we'll have to wait a little bit for those. Even though Darrah seems to be kind of spitting lately, seems like he's kind of just throwing everything out there. But we'll have to see if anyone else does. Then the final story here: Assassin's Creed Shadows previews are out. This is one of those games. I feel like Ubisoft is pretty good for this, where it seems like the majority of people who got to preview this are at least like somewhat positive to very positive. People seem to really enjoy the gameplay. The characters are good. Story's interesting. Fidelity wise, it looks great is kind of what I've seen. Not all positive. It seems like even the people who liked it, there's a lot of conversation of like, yeah, it's another Assassin's Creed game. If you liked Valhalla, if you liked Odyssey, even Origins to a point, this is the natural progression of those games. Even if it maybe has a little bit more of a grit to it, or maybe not completely, not as arcadey as, like Odyssey was. And then the people who don't like it are like, man, they really don't like it. I will say the more dissenting opinions I've seen are from exactly the people I would expect to hear them from, people I think who have kind of burned out, are a bit cynical, maybe aren't always the most optimistic folks on earth. I think what's hard for me is just in general now, it seems like so many fans are one thing, they don't have as much impact, people like me even, but these big influencers who, get hundreds of thousands of views on these previews, who get, hundreds of thousands of views on their podcasts or whatever media they do. It just seems like so many of them just go into every game now, like just with the idea of like, how much do I not like this? Instead of like even going into it being like, okay, let's see what this is all about. It's so hard for me to believe that, these folks aren't going into these previews and doing these reviews on these games with any like genuine intent to enjoy the games. Sometimes like, I feel like we saw that some with Starfield. I feel like we saw that with Senua's Saga, Hellblade 2. Obviously I'm showing a little bias right there, and, I try to be pretty honest about that. So, but I just, even Veilguard to a point, even though that was actually reviewed pretty well. I don't know. Admittedly, I'm not super excited about Assassin's Creed Shadows. If you can tell from the games I like and don't like, that aesthetic, like that setting isn't really the most exciting thing for me, even though I think it looks really cool. And, if Ubisoft sends me a code, I might check it out. But, I really didn't like Valhalla. I never even got out of like the main, like where you start. I played it for a couple hours, and I I didn't like the characters. I didn't like the way the combat felt, even though I know it was like good. Like it's one of the highlights of that game. I hated the vibes, man. It just didn't vibe with me, and I never got into it. Now, admittedly, that's in contrast to I loved Odyssey. But Odyssey was like it was like kind of silly. I play as Alexios. I'm one of the psychopaths who didn't play as Cassandra. I thought Alexios was hilarious, and I thought a lot of there was a good mix of like serious and lightheartedness and humor and exploration and fun and romance and all of that. While also, I thought some of the origin story stuff of the Assassin's Creed and all that was kind of interesting. Um, I couldn't do it with Valhalla. I felt like it took itself too seriously. God, it was so long when I saw, people saying that like to like mainline Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I want to say it was more than 50 hours. And I swear there were people who were saying like 70 to 80. Just no thanks. Absolutely not. Like, no, I am not doing that. And that's why I'm assuming will probably be the case with this game is that I'm assuming it won't be short. And that will probably be longer than I care for. I also definitely would love them to go back to more of the older style of Assassin's Creed. But even as I say that, Assassin's Creed Mirage came out in the last year or two, and I played it and I hated it. I thought it was really ugly. I thought it looked awful. I was surprised that wasn't a bigger commentary. Maybe it's because I played on console and some of the reviewers didn't. But I thought it was like kind of an ugly game, and God, it was so slow and tedious. I just I wanted to like it. I went into it super excited for it because, it kind of seemed like it was going to be that old school experience. And instead, it just felt like the Valhalla DLC that it started off as, where they tried to do some kind of old school stuff. And at least for me, it didn't hit. So I'm rooting for Assassin's Creed Shadows. I've seen people straight up being like, I hope it fails so Ubisoft shuts down. I just really don't believe people fully comprehend how bad it would be for the games industry for Ubisoft to shut down. One interesting note I saw was the 17% or whatever stock drop off. It was like $6 billion for EA is four times that is four times the worth of Ubisoft. So the 17% to try to understand the differences in all these companies, how big some of them are, like comparing Sony to Microsoft or comparing Ubisoft to EA, the 17% drop in the stock worth for EA that amounted to about $6 billion is worth 4 Ubisofts. Like Ubisoft, the gigantic publisher who has like 50 studios and like 30,000 employees. Just some food for thought. So I don't want Ubisoft to die. I admittedly, I kind of don't like indie games they're currently making or that are in the pipe, except the Division 3 I'm definitely partial to. And I enjoyed Star Wars Outlaws, and Avatar was okay. I'm curious about the next Far Cry. I'm hoping Ghost Recon can get it together again. Like, I don't hate Ubisoft the way others do. And I think that people don't realize how bad it would be for the industry to lose another independent third party AAA publisher. I understand not liking them. I understand not having any faith in them, but I think wishing them failure is very short-sighted. But that's just my opinion. That's all the stories I have for some content updates. I've been streaming a bunch and putting out a bunch of videos that will last as long as I have the time to do it. I do have like a legit like desire to try to stream more this year and be a little more involved that way. I really enjoy talking to people. So, and actually playing games on stream would be good instead of doing what I've done a lot in the last year of just, kind of getting on chatting for an hour. But when there's news and when there's things I want to talk about, I do enjoy doing that. So, be sure to check out my Twitch. It's, twitch.tv/BonDiesel. I'm over there. If you're not watching this on YouTube, go check out my YouTube as well. Just search for BonDiesel, and you'll see all my videos. But that's kind of what I'm doing. So I probably am about to get busy again. And, as the summer comes, I'll be busy with family stuff and all that. But I appreciate it if you've been coming by my YouTube channel, by the streams. I am like 50 people away, 50 subs away on YouTube from hit my, I think 3,000. Small fish for big people, but for me, it's cool. So I'll take every bit of improvement we can get. So go check those things out if you can. And that is where I'm going to wrap this episode up. If you have your own topics, questions, or feedback, be sure to let me know in my Discord or hit me up on social media at BonDiesel or at the Baunfire. Become part of the conversation by joining my Discord to chat with our little community, or by leaving comments in the YouTube videos, where you can actually leave comments on Spotify now if you listen through the app. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. That's all I have. So until next time.